Hello everyone and welcome. Hello to everyone who's here in person and also many people who are joining us this evening online for this event as well. My name is Sasha Deshmukh and I am the Chief Executive of Amnesty International UK. My pronouns are he and him. And I'm delighted to welcome people here this evening, both in person and online. Just to kick us off, I'd like to explain a little bit, if anyone has been wondering, why Amnesty International has produced the report, Social Insecurity. There's some copies around this room. I'm sure many of you I know have already been looking through it, both online and in the room, and why we think the issues that it raises and it covers are so important. And I say that with a bit of a proviso, because actually I know that if you step back in any area of human rights in which we work in Amnesty International, if rights are being respected in life, people shouldn't need to know huge amounts of detail about those rights. They shouldn't need to know huge amounts of detail about how they work. They shouldn't need to know huge amounts of detail about the law. In a rights-respecting environment, in any area of rights, they are there to enable people to be able to live their lives. Maybe people like myself might spend our time because we've taken on certain roles knowing lots of detail. But when rights are failing, people end up knowing a huge amount. And so I know in this room and I know online that sadly, I think I'm talking to a group of experts, because they're people who have had to try and understand not just rights, but a system that's failing in relation to those rights in great detail. And not just understand it in the abstract, live it, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. When we talk about human rights in this area of rights, just to be absolutely clear, we're not, important as that might be, talking about those words just with their moral meaning or as a campaigning slogan. We're talking about this area of rights in those terms because this area of rights falls under commitments and covenants that this country ratified and committed to adhere to as long ago as 1976. But unlike the safeguards that have been put in place into law around civil and political rights, and don't get me wrong, there's some challenges with how those rights are respected in this country, but at least they have their place in law and their frameworks. There's no comprehensive legal safeguards for the rights that we are talking about in this report, the rights that people in this room and online are fighting for and living day to day. Multiple UK governments of different political colours have insisted that the mix of policy and legislation is sufficient to protect these rights. For those of you who know Amnesty International, we don't likely make commentary on any area of human rights. And actually this evening you'll hear from some of the colleagues, both colleagues within Amnesty and colleagues who've worked with us in our research in this area, that helped have the depth of analysis that's important for us to bring a point of view on this as much as on anything else. So I don't say what I'm about to say lightly at all, but I want to say it absolutely clearly. We in Amnesty are clear that the UK is failing in relation to its human rights requirements on the accountability of the social security system. We in Amnesty are clear that the UK is failing in its human rights responsibilities in relation to the adequacy of the social security system. The UK is failing in relation to its human rights responsibilities on the accessibility of the social security system. It's falling short of its obligations to treat claimants with required dignity and respect, and it is failing to ensure that non-discrimination is practiced in the social security system. I know, and again I say this knowing, speaking to a rights holder audience who live the issues that I'm speaking about day to day, I know that that is not news to you. It shouldn't take me or Amnesty or anyone having to speak up about this. It shouldn't take it because it shouldn't be happening. But we want to say absolutely clearly our position on this, with our expertise in relation to human rights and those commitments that the country has made to international standards and covenants is unequivocal. And it's not just failures in those areas that I've spoken about as well. As you'll hear us talk about more this evening, sadly, the rights failures that we're talking about in these areas lead to a domino effect of other rights abuses that result. I know that's not the happiest introduction that I've ever given to a meeting. This is a serious subject, but I know also that we're in a room here, and for those who are listening to us online, of people who take the issues that we're talking about enormously seriously. So that's why I'm so pleased that we're here in Manchester for what is, as I say, an event not just here in Manchester, but a national event joined by people online. And I'm so pleased that we'll be hearing from the people we're going to hear from this evening. I should say just a couple of housekeeping points as we get going. Again, it will be no surprise to people either online or in the room that there will be some areas that you'll hear about this evening that may be moderately triggering. We're talking about serious issues, we're talking about issues that affect people's lives. I know that this is what people live day to day, but all of us can be affected by that. So if you are, please know that we're all human beings, and if you do need to step out of the room to have a breath, do, and if you do need any more assistance from any of my colleagues, please absolutely do ask for that as well. The event is being recorded, but it will only be the speakers, myself and the other speakers who you'll see this evening, whose faces will be seen. If you are in the room and you ask a question later, though, your voice may be heard. But also, if you do want to ask questions and you're here in person, after the formal part of the event has ended, the speakers and myself will still be around. So if you did have any concern about asking a question and your voice heard in a recording, you don't have to do that in formal part. You can save that for the part afterwards as well. And something I'll remind about at the end, both online, but also particularly for people in the room, you'll see some cards around the room. We aren't just producing a report in the abstract. There are obviously many incredible rights campaigners campaigning on the issues that we're talking about this evening, and have been for years, and actually I want to recognise that commitment and that work. But hopefully, if we also are adding Amnesty's strength, it's an uphill fight, don't get me wrong, but we've got some of our campaigning materials around, and in particular a campaign call and action to the Prime Minister. It's obviously a very live moment around that. But first things first, let's actually get into some of the subject matter and detail of our analysis. It's a very big report, so we can't cover it all in all of the detail, but my colleague Jen Clark, who is our Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Lead in Amnesty UK, is going to give a little bit of an introduction in some of the findings. Jen, over to you.
Thanks, Sasha. Okay, well, thank you very much to those of you in the room and those of you online who have joined us today. And also, some of you may have been taking part in the research, and I hope we've done justice to the stories that you were generously sharing with us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about why we did this work, how we went about it, and I'm going to give you some of the headlines. We also have some videos with some stories that much better demonstrate the real lived experience of this than I can, and then we'll tell you what we think needs to change as a result. Okay, so how did we reach the conclusions that I'm just about to share with you? Well, we did this because I went round Britain talking to people about their economic, social and cultural rights. What was their access to healthcare like? What was their access to adequate housing and food and education like? And the one thing that I came away with was the message that human rights are interdependent. They're indivisible. We know this, right? You take away one right and it has a knock-on impact on the others. And the right that they said was most difficult to access was social security, in that it is a linchpin for everything else within their life. So we agreed to go away and to start to tell the story of this, but from a human rights lens. And we worked with colleagues from Society Matters, who are here in the room and be talking to you later, to gather the views of 782 people around the UK. It's a huge number of people that have shared their story, and the strength of feeling was huge. We also worked with academics, Caldo Kassler and Lyle Barker, to undertake a literature review of all of the wealth of evidence. This is a well-researched area, but not from a human rights perspective. So thank you to those civil society organisations that worked with us, and in particular those ones who are mentioned there, who worked with us to understand the disproportionate impact on marginalised communities. And like all good research reports, we triangulated it with the international human rights standards for what social security looks like. What are the globally recognised indicators of success, both from the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but also from the ILO as well. Now, 157 pages and 700 plus people's views are very difficult to articulate in a short report back to you here today. So what I've tried to do is to pull it together into almost like a report card. Do we succeed or do we fail as a nation in our right to social security? And why do we even need a report card? We know, because politicians are telling us this, and we're living it and breathing it, that the system's broken. We know that already, and we know that it's created insecurity because we have unprecedented levels of poverty here in the UK. And poverty is the biggest indicator that you have a non-human rights compliant social security system. We know that. So we could stop the presentation here and we could all go away and say, Amnesty says it's not human rights compliant. But what putting it next to those criteria gives us is an understanding of why and where the system is broken and how it needs to be fixed. They're international standards based on international good practice, and we should consider those. Okay, so we're going to get into the detail of it here, and I'm leaving the lived experience reflections to colleagues to talk about later on. So the first indicator is there a long-term plan for social security to make sure that it progressively realises our rights? There's supposed to be a plan financially, but also indicators for like progressively realising the right to food, changing the levels of poverty. So you can measure and see, are they being successful? And in the UK, we do not have that strategy. The DWP have a plan, which is in place, and that plan prioritises engagement with employment. And so using the social security system to drive people into employment rather than drive people out of poverty. And if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, and we can see that through the austerity measures that have been set out by successive governments, and including the government that's incumbent now. Is it available to everyone, covering all social risks? So there's a long list of risks it's supposed to cover: pregnancy, accidents at work, unemployment, illness, disability. And here in the UK, on paper, at least you could say, well, where it's available, you know, we have all of these schemes in place. But our findings are that there is a material inavailability of social security for social risks in the UK. And the reason, one of the reasons we conclude that is because we have 23 billion entitlements that are not claimed in the UK. Why is that? Well, the government can't necessarily show you any kind of in-depth analysis of that, but on the basis of the evidence that we have, we think that's because of stigma. And that stigma is perpetuated by politicians, by the media, and totally prevalent within our communities. We know that it's unclaimed because people cannot understand what their rights are. It's very difficult to navigate. You have to learn a whole other language to try and understand what you're entitled to. And we know it's materially unavailable because you cannot get access to the support and advice that you need to be able to claim your entitlements. Support services like Citizens Advice, Turn to Us, Z2K are overwhelmed with requests for support in a very difficult, complicated situation. And in some places, there are complete advice deserts. Also, for some people, they're just completely excluded on the basis of immigration status, so if they have no recourse to public funds, for example. Is the social security system accessible? Well, Sash has already told you, we've concluded that it is not accessible. And that is because of the complexity of the system. We looked at the application process, the eligibility assessments that are undertaken, and how they administer it once you've got the claim. And what we found is that it's so complicated, it's difficult to navigate. We found that the DWP are failing to make reasonable adjustments for people who might need different communication needs. So, for example, asking people who are deaf to do a telephone assessment for eligibility. And we found that due to the digital divide, there are some people who find it increasingly difficult not just to make a claim, but to manage the claim when it's there. And that's not just about digital skills. It's also about choosing not to pay for broadband or data because it's not affordable for you. And on top of that, the government have made a range of policy measures that make accessible social security even more difficult, like caps and excluding certain people from the ability to get income support, like a third child, for example. So across the board, we are grading the social security system as failed to meet the international human rights standards for those criteria. Adequacy is the thing that we all talk about. Is it enough? Does it put enough money in your pocket to make sure that you can afford the essentials for life? Okay, what's supposed to happen under that international standard is that they're supposed to define what are the essentials. What should you touch and feel in your life? You could eat 3 meals a day. You have a house that is adequate for your needs and doesn't compromise your health. You have the resources you need to stay healthy and well. They're supposed to cost that up, and that should be the benefit level. But that's not the case here in the UK. What they've done is set a starting point on the basis of what they think it should be, not on the basis of a calculation of the essentials. So when it's too low, I'm going to do this a lot. You've got a floor that it should be at. You've already put it too low. And when you uprate it in a way that doesn't track with the real costs of the essentials, you're making it even lower. And then the government have put in place freezes on uprating, caps on benefits so that you can't earn over a certain amount. And then they take deductions from your benefit from day one for universal credit if you've had a 5-week wait loan. And you're continuing to erode the amount of money that people have got to pay their bills, to feed their children. So what claimants are telling us all the way through the report about the hardships that they face, the impossible choices that they're making in their day-to-day lives, that are day-to-day choices we wouldn't even think about. Do I put my child in the bath because it's cold, or do I not bath them today? Do I pay for food for my children and mean that they can't go on their school trip? These are like simple everyday choices. Which bill do you not pay? In terms of non-discrimination, the duty for non-discrimination is embedded in the international standards, and what we conclude in our report is there are disproportionate impacts of policy measures on particular communities. So if you take racialized communities, they're more likely to be sanctioned, they're more likely to be impacted by the 2-child limit, and of course there are the direct discrimination on the basis of immigration status. We also have a conversation about the standard around meaningful consultation. Are people claiming benefits meaningfully able to shape the decisions that government make? And we know here in the UK, because it's in the news all the time, the government lost a public law project-sponsored judicial review in January 2025 because they had failed to consult meaningfully. You can see this tracked through the Pathways to Work Green paper, which is in the news, the cuts to sickness and disability benefits. There was a protest here in Manchester yesterday protesting this exact thing. Most of the cuts are outside of the scope of the consultation. It is not meaningful. And for all of these criteria, they fail across the board. Is it well managed and administrated? Is there accountability and independent oversight for how the government deliver the social security system? Well, you can see from the way that eligibility for health and disability benefits are carried out that it is not effective. You get assessed by DWP, you get told that you can't. I think 48% of people do not get offered the claim. If they go to tribunal, the independent tribunal overturns that in 7 out of 10 claims. It is not an effective process. It costs a lot of money to run. There are official errors where they can take people's money away from them with a deduction to reclaim the error of DWP without telling people that that's happening. Imagine that. You go to your bank and you've got less money than you expected to get. We are going to release a report on the implications of automated decision-making within DWP. It is not clear what implications that has because they will not give information about how they use that. And people don't know that they can appeal, particularly for sanctions. So there is no independent regulator, no inspection, no Ofsted for DWP or for job centres. That doesn't exist. That independent safeguard is not there. What we have instead is DWP marking their own homework. They do what's called a leap assessment, where they think they've made an error that affects lots of people, and those have been criticised in their application of those by the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. And they have reactive accountability. The National Audit Office might do an inquiry, but it's all reactive to something that's gone wrong. There's no independent checks, no audits proactively. So we conclude that they failed across the board. John's going to tell you a story now.
It's disappointing that after 30 years of service, I've got medals, I've got an OBE for my services to British military interests, to come home and find that actually the support that people need just isn't there. Hi, my name is John, and this is my story. I used to be fit. I used to go cycling. I deployed with the Ministry of Defence. Having MS has completely changed my life. I can't walk without sticks. I use 2 sticks, and now I struggle to go a mile down the road to go on the bus to go to a supermarket that I use the PIP to pay for cleaners to come to this flat, simply because I just can't do it. The other thing that I use it for is transport. As I say, I don't drive it anymore, and I need a taxi. I have bladder and bowel issues. Everything takes me longer, and I often find myself having to get changed and re-showered. So the PIP process, it almost didn't matter what I said, because the process was set out, and even if it was what I felt was inconsistent or didn't make any sense, that was where the system was pointing me towards. And it just felt like a sort of alien, unhelpful process that didn't address the issues that affected me. Yeah, my first reaction was disbelief. This is a Labour government. And I was a member of the Labour Party when I was a student, and this wasn't what I signed up for. I was very happy to be a taxpayer, so that the system could provide support for disabled people and people who needed benefits. I just didn't think ever that I was going to be one of them.
I think those are powerful words from John there. His experience of trying to claim PIP, even with all of the needs he's just explained, was that he was refused. He was scored 0. And had to go to an 18-month appeal process to get what he was entitled to. There we go. So Sasha mentioned earlier about dignity. This is one of the things for me that I think I found most difficult in writing the report and sitting in on the interviews. There is a real issue with the way that people are being treated. They feel dehumanized by the system. They feel stigmatized by the system, and in fact, you know, if you go and access the NHS, there are standards for dignity and respect. It gets inspected, but those same standards are not wedded in, they're not woven into the social security system. And as a result, what we have actually instead is a consciously cruel system. And I don't use those words lightly, I justify that. It is conscious because it's embedded in policy. The sanctions regime creates fear, it creates precarity and powerlessness within claimants to the extent where they're worried to go to the toilet in case they miss a phone call because they might lose 100% of their income. Imagine that. Imagine you're late for work one day and someone just takes away 100% of your income. How would you cope? And even if they don't get sanctioned, the fear is constantly there. So it's embedded in the policy. It's also embedded in the culture. And claimants talk to us about going into a job coach appointment and being told to leave their small children outside because we don't let children in here, or being told that if they don't come to an appointment, they're going to be sanctioned, even though their child died days before. You could not believe the number of stories, and if you read one section in the report, I would urge you to read this. We are in a situation where we are consciously cruel to people who are vulnerable and need support. It doesn't cost money to fix that. That is not a fiscal issue, it is a cultural one. So, because we have this situation where we've got a broken system, we've already agreed it creates insecurity, we also have to acknowledge that the failings in the social security system cut off other rights. So you then have a knock-on impact on whether you can afford to eat enough food to stay healthy. You have an impact on your ability to pay for school clothes for your children, adequate housing. You've got a situation where the right to health is also compromised, and so many people talk to us about the mental health impact, which I believe Neil is going to go into more detail about later. It's unbelievable, the extent to which that is widespread. So Carly's going to tell us her experience of this domino effect of the right to social security.
I can't pay my bills. I can't feed my kid. I am a single parent with no backup, right? Like if I don't get that universal credit, if it doesn't come through, I don't have anywhere else to turn to. My name is Carly. When I first went back to work and started private renting in London and my son was in nursery, I was claiming universal credit for a number of years, and this is my experience. I wasn't able to get any support from the council in terms of accommodation. My part-time salary didn't cover my rent and childcare. I'd secured a permanent role, so I'd moved into a permanent role from a temporary role, and they paid my holiday pay. The system had read this as a much higher sort of salary payment that month than what I was expecting. So my claim was cancelled. The only option was to make a new claim, but I'd have a 5-week wait. It was like panic and fear and just this kind of almost like disbelief and frustration of, I can't pay my rent, I can't, you know, it's too far away till payday, and they can't do anything for me apart from do another claim and wait another 5 weeks. I remember being on the phone to them and just crying at the train station on my way to work, kind of being like in disbelief. You know, they're making it difficult deliberately, right? Because they don't want you sort of claiming that money to support you and that you need and are entitled to. But the reality is that most people are barely surviving on universal credit. And I think particularly now when everything is so insecure, costs are so high, bills are so high, salaries, just nothing is going up in line with that. Just for people to kind of, go back to that original purpose of why was social security set up? Like, why is it there? You know, most people are inherently good and we just want to kind of get on with life and be able to do that in a comfortable and secure way. And I think everyone has a right to that sort of comfort and security in life, and that the system should be there to support people in those time and needs to do that.
So the main purpose of social security,
I can't pay my...
Oh, sorry. There's a slide that I've skipped. Okay, so I want to talk about the Pathways to Work Green Paper. This landed in the middle of our research, but we had enough time to look at the proposals, and so we're accepting that they're still proposals. And so what we did with the Pathways to Work Green Paper was to take the tests for retrogression. Retrogression means it's prohibited under the international covenants at the UN, and it means you make things worse on purpose. You make a decision to make things worse, yeah? And there are times, like during austerity, where you are allowed to consider it if you meet these tests. Have you considered, as a state, all of these things? So we've applied those tests in our report, and we conclude that actually they haven't considered all of the less restrictive alternatives. They haven't considered other ways to ensure that they can prevent the impact of austerity. They know, they've assessed themselves, it's 250,000 more people at their own estimate who will be in poverty. Those numbers have gone up since then, and we can consider that it's going to be significantly more. I think 48% of people under the existing eligibility that get PIP will no longer be eligible for PIP. And so we say that this is deliberately discriminatory, it is retrogressive, and it will violate human rights. So I think it's important to say that. Why is it possible for this domino effect to happen? When they're making a policy, should they not have to consider the knock-on impact on other rights? Well, what we have is a situation in the UK where this criteria around ensuring that these rights are protected in law is not happening. There are limited laws protecting the right to social security. I'm going to do it again. That social protection floor, the absolute minimum floor that no one should fall below, does not exist in our legislation. Instead, it is left to ideological and political whim of the incumbent government, of the Secretary of State and the Exchequer. Those changes of government can mean they can put the level down, further down, get it even further down, even though they know they're putting people into more poverty. The law does not allow for the courts to think about these things as human rights violations and compel change. So when there was a judicial review on the two-child limit, even though the court could accept it might contravene the human rights of children under the Covenant on the Rights of the Child, they were not allowed to consider that because it's not in UK law. Okay, and the failing safeguards procedurally, when a government passes a new piece of legislation, a minister has to write on the legislation, this is human rights compliant. We believe this is human rights compliant. In doing that, they look only at civil and political rights. So they do not consider the implications for whether they're going to make more people homeless or more people hungry or impact people's health. They don't have to do that because they're not considering the impact of all human rights. So they fail. I'm just going to do a stock tick. I'm not reading these out. I just want to do a stock tick. We are in the UK, and the social security system in the UK means we use these words: fear, precarity, consciously cruel, discriminatory. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. How are we in this position? And what should we be doing about it? So this is what we think is needed to fix the system. Absolutely, in the middle here are the urgent fixes. We have system-based harms happening now to people like Carly, to people like John. There are urgent fixes needed. We need to remove the two-child limit, the benefit caps, and make sure that the 5-week wait does not have a loan attached to it where they immediately deduct it from your benefits. We need to stop the planned cuts and end the sanctions regime, which is so harmful for people's physical and mental health. But the system is broken beyond repair. It has moved so far away from its original purpose that Carly so articulated, oh, I can't even say that word, ironically, was very articulate about earlier. The system needs a complete overhaul. It needs to be put on track for the purpose of an adequate standard of living, making sure that nobody has to live in poverty and deprivation. And so we are calling for a statutory commission, a little bit like the Beveridge Commission was originally, or a royal commission, that will have statutory powers to rebuild and repurpose the social security system with human rights and dignity at its heart. And within that, you're going to say this, We need a social protection floor. You hear Trussell, Trust and JRF call it an essentials guarantee. That floor must be calculated and protected in law. And you will expect us to say this because we're Amnesty International, we need to fix the holes in our human rights protections. We will continue to see the domino effect on rights until we acknowledge these rights in law so that people can get access to justice when they're violated. So I'm going to hand you back to Sasha now. Thank you very much for bearing with me, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Jen. And I'm going to be joined up here, actually, if Graham and Rick would come up as well, and Neil's just here, for the next part of the evening. Just before I do that, I'd like to both give enormous thanks to our BSL interpreter who's on screen, as you can see if you're in the room in the right of the room, but also give an apology. There are meant to be 2 BSL interpreters working with us this evening, but one unfortunately has technical issues being able to connect, which is why I want to apologise that we don't have BSL interpretation for all of the parts of the evening, but the recording will have captions, so if there is anyone who's missing part of the discussion because of that, I apologise, but it is all captured in the recording, and obviously enormous thanks to our interpreter who's working so hard on screen. Now, I'd like to introduce Neil, who's on the far right here, my far right, up on stage. Neil was one of the 2 critical researchers for the report, interviewing claimants in all 4 nations and regions across the UK, and leading on survey work as well that formed part of the report's evidence base with claimants and with systems advisors. Neil, we'd love to hear some of your reflections on conducting the research. You obviously will have found huge amounts of things compelling, maybe the things less surprising, but even some things surprising even with your expertise in conducting the research. And you clearly have views on the limitations of human rights protections in relation to social security here in the UK. So over to you, Neil, please.
Hello. I mean, I'm trying to find out where to go here because there's a lot to cover in not a lot of time. The first thing I'd like to say is that it wasn't just me doing it. Emily here was some people would say partner in crime, other people would say minder, when we were out on the road looking after me. It was a great honour to do this research because we got to speak to hundreds of people in the end about their experiences with the benefit system. And we were welcomed into communities, and then they shared with us some of the most powerful stories I've ever heard. So I've got a few notes here I'm going to share with you. What we saw were people who were surviving. They weren't living. They were surviving, day to day, week to week. And they lived in absolute fear. Fear of a sanction regime which so many of them considered to be an inevitability, a when, not an if, they were going to fall foul of the system that was waiting to punish them. I don't think I've really ever had the same relationship with my mobile phone as I had after I've spoke to people for whom having a charged mobile phone was the most important thing in their day-to-day business, because missing a call could lose them everything. Because it didn't matter why that phone wasn't charged, if they didn't take the call, they got sanctioned. We heard so many stories where, as Jen said, the lack of dignity shone through, and later on I'm going to illustrate a few of them. We heard so many people talk about suicide and open up to us about their suicidal ideation when faced with the benefit system, the social security system, their entitlement. People who paid into national insurance and now are being denied it to the point where they were going to commit suicide. We were stunned by the lack of support that people had, and the way that they were cast onto sort of the rocks of just deal with it yourself. And we know, we both work for Citizens Advice in Gateshead. We know how busy it is. We see 20,000 people a year. We see 10% of Gateshead population through our door. But there are some people that don't have those resources. They're not available to them, and they're faced with a ridiculously complicated system. We also saw really inspiring stories of bravery and compassion and community, of people ganging together to help each other. A wonderful moment in Birmingham where our research broke down slightly as people started to share tips on which food bank gave the gluten-free food out. And suddenly we had to stop for a moment because it became a proper little sharing moment in the room as people were helping each other out. So I'm going to share a few stories with you, the things that we found out. We discovered that in Hull, they have a phrase, to go to the bridge. And it is what you think it is. And we heard it enough times that we had to ask, what do you mean by going to the bridge? I just went, oh, consider throwing myself off the Humber Bridge. We heard that enough times in 36 hours to realise that it was a local saying. And all we were doing was going to community centres and asking them about what's your experience of claiming benefits. We learned that if your English isn't your first language, if you are not proficient in IT, if you haven't got a reasonable education and ability to comprehend and parse the system that's in front of you, or if you have a disability that also makes that difficult, then you are disadvantaged. And when you get the intersectionality of those things together, you are doubly and triply disadvantaged. Again, we visited a school in Birmingham, which was primarily, the people who we spoke to were women from the Asian community, with interpreters, members of their community who were interpreting for them to speak to us. And we ended up at the end of that session holding a mini advice workshop, because we couldn't, in all good grace, walk out of that room without trying to help them at least signpost to what they needed. We spoke to a woman in London who used to use candles for light so that her children could do their homework, and now can't afford candles, so they just have to use the natural light. We're from the northeast. We don't see the sun between October and March. Can't imagine what it would be like having children who are trying to achieve an education but can't see the work that they're writing because they can't afford the electricity in order to do that. Light poverty is a real thing. We met an inspiring woman in Wales with epilepsy, who, while she was doing her teacher training, was told by the DWP that she couldn't get any help because her flatmates could look after her if she had a seizure. You know, the people she was thrown into the flat with in Freshers Week, they were suddenly deemed by the DWP to be her support network. But what the knock-on effect of that is, when Jen talks about the domino effect, was that in order to get to her school placements, because she was training to be a teacher, she had to get set off ridiculously early to get up the valley, to get to the school she was at, in order to be able to get there before the children to appear professional, but sleep deprivation was the thing that triggered her epilepsy. And she ended up having multiple seizures during that time, where a taxi would have saved that. There are more. I could go on. But the one thing that came across it, and I know Emily has heard this so many times, when we came out of somewhere, I said, either the people who run this system are not aware this is going on, or somebody is sat there going, working as intended. And as the report proved, and that use of that phrase, conscious cruelty, sadly, it's the latter.
Thank you, Neil. I should say to people in the room there will be an opportunity for questions, so please do be thinking of some of those as the speakers are speaking, and I'll maybe have some for you later on as well, Neil. But next we're going to hear from Rick, who is just to my right. Rick is the Outreach and Development Lead and Outreach and Development and Campaigns Lead at the Greater Manchester Coalition for Disabled People. He's also part of the Amnesty family as an activist, as part of the activist-led Amnesty Disabled People's Human Rights Network. Rick, I'll use a very proper word, maybe I've been sort of hanging around the UN too much. There are limitations in UK human rights law. You may feel you want to say a word more strongly than that, feel free. But you may also, I know, have some thoughts, and Jen touched on that. This is a long-standing, huge human rights violation, and yet also something that's moving very quickly in terms of new government proposals. So there's a lot going on in both of those, and you'll have reflections on the report as a whole as well.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, the internet. Yeah, I mean, just to say about this report very quickly, it's one of those. Remember when we had a meeting, which was briefed about it from Jan, and it was, you sort of said it was like, it felt like you kind of been crawling through the desert, starving and hungry and thirsty, most of all thirsty. And this was like a glass of ice water. It's like we've been heard. And this has gone on for decades. It really accelerated with the Welfare Act of the previous Labour government in 2008, 2009. It's when they brought in ESA. Then it absolutely ramped up once the coalition came in. But I'd say the starting gun for this particular orientation of what should be a social security system into what I would say is a shadow penal system, but without the protectionism of the criminal justice system, because they generally can't starve you in the criminal justice system. That started for me in that 1992 speech of Peter Lilly at the Conservative Conference, which is detailed in John Pring's brilliant book, The Department, where he did a little Gilbert and Sullivan pastiche about having a little list, the single mothers and the scroungers and the asylum seekers. It was a hit list of who he was going to impoverish. And it's churned on since then. And there's been thousands of deaths. We can't absolutely say for sure how many exactly. There's certainly studies for a number of increased suicides, the rate of increased suicides. But to bring us up to date, you go through this, you've had 15 years of austerity, and at the back of that, however bad it was, there was that like hypothetical, well, there could be a different government, so it could stop, or it could lessen a bit. So we got a different government, and it fucking jammed its foot down on the pedal even harder. Measurably, these policies in the Green Paper are further and nastier than anything the Tories were going to do in 2024. So, just existentially speaking, we have a crisis of democracy. Because at the moment, you cannot vote for a party that is capable of gaining power in this country that is not going to attack social security. Reform will, the Conservatives will, and the Labour Party are. So we've got a much bigger problem, which is why it's fantastic to bring in this dimension of human rights and the strength of Amnesty, because we need to be gathering together more allies to fight. Yesterday, the DWP came to Manchester to do their shitty little bullshit consultation. 22 policies in the Green Paper. Only 10 minor policies will they allow you to consult on. So we found out where it was. We marched down there. We got into the hotel foyer and we would not leave. Police came, hotel security came, hotel manager came. Ultimately, we insisted they let us into the room. We asked the disabled people in that room, do you vote for us to come in and do a proper consultation? They said yes, we did. At the end of it, we also asked, do you accept or do you reject the Green Paper? Unanimously rejected the Green Paper, although that's not, of course, a question they officially asked. So there are several more of these consultations happening around the country. I urge activists around the country, find out where they are, gate crash them, and hold a democratic meeting to tell the government it has to drop the Pathways to Work Green Paper, or we will become ungovernable. There will be a one-term government, and the Labour Party will be dead after this. Do not take no for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And we see a lot of things around the world, but what a day when, in order to participate in public engagement with the government, you have to use the word gate crash. No, I think gate crash is right. You just shouldn't have to gate crash. No one should have to gate crash. I think, from what I understand, the meeting yesterday, I wasn't in Manchester until just before this meeting, but I understand, I think it was extremely small numbers of people who they wanted to have in the room. So quite far from most people's interpretation of consultation, I would think, even if they were going to talk about any subject matter, let alone a limited one. But more importantly than my views on that, I'd like to now ask Graham to speak. Now, Graham is the Chief Executive of Resolve Poverty. Many of you, I think, here in the room will know a Manchester-based not-for-profit organisation working with local authorities and partners nationally to end poverty. Graham, you'll also have reflections on the report's findings, human rights compliance. You may also, of course, want to be talking about some of the latest political developments as well. So please, over to you with your thoughts.
So thanks so much, and hi everyone, and thanks to Jen and Neil and Rick for talking so passionately about these issues. I know we won't have time for Q&A as well this evening, so I'll try not to repeat what's been said. I'll probably talk a bit of a higher level. Some of the work we do at Resolve Poverty has been said. You know, it's about sort of what localities can do to respond to poverty. You know, what's in the gift of local authorities, other local public bodies, how can BCSE sector, voluntary community sector partners working at that local level also kind of advance the kind of anti-poverty agenda. So some of the work we do is about policy areas that don't get much of a kind of airing in the media or in the national policy debate. You know, we're looking at things like the Household Support Fund, discretionary housing payments, council tax support, some of those things that are in the gift of localities when thinking about how we can support people on low incomes and people at risk of financial hardship. So I'll talk a bit at a high level, so I apologise if some of those things aren't areas that you perhaps know a huge amount about. I know United are playing at home this evening, so I really want to get away for the second half, but more than happy to chat to people after 8 o'clock if you want to understand anything in a bit more detail that I do mention. I think the first thing to say is one of the things we work on as an organisation, and I know Amnesty support this as well, is something called the socio-economic duty. So there's no requirement at the moment on public bodies in England to take into account the impact that their decisions have on people experiencing socio-economic disadvantage or experiencing poverty. People might be aware that under equalities law, local authorities, other public bodies have to consider protected characteristics, but socio-economic status isn't one of those. There is something in the Equality Act 2010 called the socio-economic duty, but it was never brought into force. Governments have repeatedly rejected that call. We've worked very actively at Resolve Poverty with a lot of rights-based organisations like Amnesty, like Just Fair and others, to call on public bodies, particularly local and regional public bodies, to voluntarily adopt the socio-economic duty. And some have done that to really good effect. They're saying, look, we're not required legally to think about the impact of our decisions on people experiencing socio-economic disadvantage, but we're going to do that anyway ourselves. We're going to hold ourselves to account on that. And where local authorities, other public bodies like Transport for Greater Manchester, Merseyside Fire and Rescue have done that, it's actually driven positive decision making at that local regional level. So Merseyside Fire and Rescue have used socio-economic duty to recruit more people into the fire service from low-income backgrounds in that area. Salford City Council have used it to really inform budgetary decisions that they've made as a council and to protect some of those budgets that are vital in terms of meeting the needs of low-income residents. So from our point of view as an organisation, you know, I think we're constantly looking at kind of what this agenda means at a local level and what are the local levers that we can pull and how do we build in more protections, rights-based protections for people at that local level. Because we know at a national level, we don't take a rights-based approach, as Jen has said, to social security. We don't take a rights-based approach to addressing poverty. I mean, at a UK level, we've not had a national strategy for or plan for tackling poverty in any meaningful sense for well over a decade. And the consequences of that have been really significant. Now, I'm not saying that if we'd had a national poverty strategy back during the coalition years, we wouldn't have had austerity, but we would have had some of the architecture we need in place to protect people from the worst effects of government policy. We know that actually, as Rick has said really powerfully, government policy is pushing people into hardship and poverty, and that looks like that is continuing given the current government's approach to social security. So a few things I think from us in terms of priorities, and Jen very much touched on these and alluded to these in her presentation. The reason I talked about the socio-economic duty in particular is because the government is committed to enacting that. So that and was also committed to introducing a national child poverty strategy. So we've got this, calling it attention doesn't feel like it's giving enough weight to it. But we've got this kind of conflict, I guess, in terms of national government policy at the moment, where you've got social security policies, which are going to impact on people negatively, to put it lightly, but then some other things happening within government, which are about creating the architecture that we need to address poverty and do positive things. So National Child Poverty Strategy and action of the socio-economic duty are kind of the two key pillars of that as we see them. But obviously we need those things. There is a tension, and we need something to kind of come out on top in terms of that tension. Jen mentioned things like the 2-child limit on benefits, that needs to be scrapped. The benefit cap, that needs to be scrapped. The 5-week wait on universal credit is absolutely hammering people. Around 50% of all households with children that are in receipt of universal credit have some form of deduction on their universal credit payment. Most of those as a result of having to take a loan whilst they waited for their universal credit payment to come in. So it's absolutely hammering people. We know that benefits aren't adequate. We know that benefits don't enable people to achieve even to meet even the essentials. But actually, when you look at the value of universal credit, for so many people, that's not what they're getting month in, month out, because they've got a deduction on that payment. So that advance loan that people get when they apply for universal credit needs to be replaced by a non-repayable grant. There's a big opportunity for us when we think about the benefit system in terms of driving up people's incomes, and it was on one of Jen's slides. I hope people kind of noticed it. But £23 billion worth of benefits go unclaimed in the UK every year. It's a huge amount of money, and that's money that sits on a balance sheet in the Treasury and never reaches people's pockets, and therefore never reaches our local communities. So it's not just damaging for those individuals, but it's money that's not being spent in our local shops, local retailers, etc. So really damaging for everyone in every community across the country that money isn't reaching people. So a national child poverty strategy has really got to drive change on this agenda, particularly against some of those things that I've just mentioned. That's really important. But we have got a huge tension in terms of kind of government intentions and what they want policy to be leading towards, which is a reduction in child poverty, a greater focus on socioeconomic disadvantage when decisions are being made, against the kind of social security measures and policies that are being proposed at the moment, which others have talked really articulately and passionately about. So kind of a lot to do going forward. But I think there's another point that I'd just like to finish on really, which is just how we shift this agenda. You know, that kind of negative narrative around benefits, social security, welfare, whatever terminology is used, is really pervasive. It's been really pervasive at a national level, as we've seen, and that's why governments come in and feel like they can take the steps that they take. But it's also pervasive to a degree, a lesser degree, thankfully, at a local level. You know, so when local authorities are thinking about the local welfare support they provide, when they're thinking about commissioning welfare rights services and benefits advice services, that negative narrative around benefits and the social security system does impact on decisions sometimes at that local level, and that's something, you know, we're really mindful of and something we've really got to guard against. And so just to bring it back to the focus of the Amnesty report, you know, I've talked about the socioeconomic duty, talked about the national child poverty strategy, but absolutely Amnesty are right to kind of bring a human rights lens into this agenda, because that's another thing that could be part of the architecture we need in this country to protect people from negative government policies.